Good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Barrett. I'm the director here at the Iowa Quilt Museum, and I'm so happy that you're joining us today for our virtual Iowa Quiltscape program. This is Tuesday, February 23rd, and our guest is Millie Kehrli, and Millie is joining us from her classroom in Johnston. She is an 8th grade language arts teacher and 9th grade journalism, if I remember correctly. But today she's going to share with us about Mary Barton and Mary's Iowa connections and her quilting legacy. Just a couple of housekeeping bits before we start that. We do ask that everyone keep their video turned off and themselves muted for now. If you would like to make a comment in the chat window, you're very much welcome to do that, and I will keep monitoring that to add to the conversation. And we may do a little bit of a Q&A at the end if we're kind of led that direction. This is a very informal production, but we do want to kind of eliminate all those distractions. So if you would keep yourself muted, appreciate that. We'll give you some information at the end of the program about how you can learn about the Iowa Quilt Museum itself. Visit our online gift shop, find recordings of past programs, make a donation, etc., etc. But right now, let's just jump in. I'm going to take myself off of the screen and turn things over to Millie. Would you just give us an introduction about yourself? Tell us who you are and how you got to where you are with this Mary Barton journey.
All right. I am, like Megan said, an 8th and 9th grade teacher at Johnston Middle School. And just for the record, for those of you who are just joining, I have my lunch period and my plan period stacked together today. So I am not shirking my duties or anything. I am doing my doctoral research for Drake University for a PhD in education. And I've always been fascinated by how to use objects in classrooms, especially quilts, in ways other than just hanging them on your wall. How do you use them to reach students, to start conversations, to enter into discussion on whatever it is you're learning? And so when I started my PhD, using quilts in the classroom was where I really wanted to end up. And the Barton collection is the absolutely, die and go to heaven thing for a researcher interested in quilts.
Excellent. So Millie's going to do a screen share with us, and I've got her video also spotlighted, so you should be able to see her face next to her screen share. You may also find that you have kind of a split screen function going on where you can take a little bar and slide it to the left or the right. If you want to see more of Millie or less of Millie and more of the screens, you can make yourself comfortable that way. I think I will also go ahead and add myself to the spotlight in case I decide to pop into the conversation. But if you've got questions, just a reminder, go ahead and pop them into the chat window and I will keep watching that. But Millie's got some slides to share with us and she's ready to go. So take it away.
All right. Well, before I begin, I really need to give you a bit of a disclaimer on my perspective on tackling this. Telling and retelling the story of Mary Barton and her textile legacy will not go in a straight line from beginning to end. Honestly, in all the research I've done so far, I'm not sure I've even found the beginning or the end. So, my philosophy as an educator is that human beings learn through stories, and stories often circle back on themselves as they are told and retold. So I'm approaching Mary's story, from the perspective of an educator. I'm conducting narrative biographical research on her life. Mary was a quilter, a collector, a historian, and a mentor, though not always in that order. She was also a very inquisitive child, a woman, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a collaborator, a friend. She just has so many different things going on that there are so many different ways to look at her life, and quilts are just one of many. Initially, I was really interested in how quilts could tell stories in a classroom, and the collection of Mary Barton, as I said, just really seemed a great place to start. But the more time I spent with the quilts, the fabric samples, the books, the patterns, the women's periodicals from the 19th and 20th century, all of the correspondence she amassed with other famous quilt names and things in the quilt world. I just became more and more fascinated with her continuous process of learning. So we're going to talk about some of that today. For me, the most difficult part with Mary's story is trying to figure out exactly where to begin. Through a chronological lens, Mary was born on June 9th, 1917. Mary Alice Barton was born to Harold and Edith Lyle Pembleton near Indianola, Iowa, third child, first girl of 6. To mark her place in time, that's 3 years before women in the United States had the right to vote, and 71 years after Iowa became a state. She was a genealogist who traced her roots and ancestors all the way back to ancestors who served under George Washington in the Revolutionary War. And she highlighted one family in her research that sent 8 sons from the Union into the Civil War. So the family stories are terribly important to Mary. Her genealogical research, all of her research, is carefully stored in 3-ring binders with page protectors, newspaper articles, clippings, everything that documents all of this. And I think if I could ask her today, if her story started the day she was born, I think she would say it started long before that, with all of the stories that influenced her throughout her life. This piece of homespun here is in the collection at the State Historical Museum. Almost everything I'm going to show you today, by the way, is from the State Historical Museum of Iowa that houses the Barton collection. Mary also donated many, many objects to Iowa State University Library and Quilts to Living History Farms in Iowa. So her collections were massive, and she left behind such a rich educational legacy through all of these things. But this homespun fabric was woven by Mary's great-grandmother, Mary Stevens Krause, who was born in 1824 in North Carolina, died in 1901 near Panora, Iowa. According to Mary Stevens Krause's obituary, she raised sheep, she spun and wove fabric from their wool, and of course they compared her to the Proverbs 31 woman for all of the wonderful things she did for her family. Mary Stevens Krause had a total of 3 years of schooling. Or not 3 years, 3 weeks of schooling. Her obituary said her mother died on their pioneer homestead in Iowa. So the family had moved from North Carolina to Indiana and then to Iowa. A couple of years after they arrived in Iowa, her mom died, left behind a whole lot of children. And Mary, being the oldest, was kept home to take care of the kids. Genealogical research as it goes. These are Mary's handwritten notes. I'm pointing at my screen. You can't see my hands, but you can see my screen. She has, Mary Stevens Krause was born in 1824. And then they said, she was a baby when they came to Indiana or to Iowa. The way the math works, it looks like she must have been about 2 years old when she took over the household tasks. I'm not sure that can be correct. So, you've got to look at all of this and ask the questions and then keep digging. But what I do know is that Mary was just enthralled with all of the stories of her ancestors and what they did in their lives as pioneers, and how the families just kept moving westward to expand on land. They all had 8 or 10 children. So they were moving westward to find new places and expand. One line in her obituary really caught my attention. It said that several years before her death, during a rest from work on account of a broken arm, one of her sons, and by then she had 10 kids, 9 of them survived her, which is unusual, but one of her sons taught her how to read while she had a broken arm. And then she enjoyed reading very, very much throughout her later years. There we go. I have to figure out which button to push to make this go forward. These are some pages, some information out of some of her notebooks. Everything is bound and kept in notebooks. This is a quilt of homespun that her great-grandmother Krause had made, and it was in kind of rough shape. Well, then she found another kind of folded up piece of homespun inside a cover that was a makeshift mattress, probably used in a baby carriage. So Mary was able to take fabric from the makeshift mattress then, and then repair some of the work of her grandmother's. This quilt is now at Living History Farm. That's what the LHF there stands for. So Mary was interested in the stories the quilts told, and then how to preserve them so they could keep telling those stories. All right. It would be very, very easy to get. Did you have a question?
Can I just jump in for a quick second?
Sure.
You've got visitors who are not familiar with what Living History Farms is. We're kind of taking it for granted, myself included. So it's a pioneer museum in Iowa, just west of Des Moines, where history is really brought to life. And so I guess I don't know the time period, but it's mid 1800s, I believe. And there's a house, there's a barn, there's a millinery shop, there's a blacksmith, there's a broom making shop. And so all of these, kind of heritage trades are really brought to life. And then there's a textile collection that kind of goes on display in the museum proper, in the kind of main museum area. So anyway, that's what Living History Farms is. It's a living museum of sorts.
Yes, and I think they have like an 1800s farm, a 1900s farm, kind of a small, what a rural town would have been like, a main street. And they also, last time I checked, and I have not, obviously with pandemic, haven't been there for a long time, but they had an Iowa American Indian village set up as well. So yeah, a great place for hands-on experience of history.
Yeah, absolutely. And Janice has put the website link to Living History Farms, or lhf.org. If anyone wants to pop in and learn more about that. So, okay, sorry for interrupting. Carry on.
No problem. And sometimes when you try to speak, it's silent for a second until I be quiet. And then, so if you wave at me or something, if I don't catch that you wanted to say something. All right. Yeah, it was very easy. I got lost in Mary's backstory many, many times as I went through the archives and looked at all of the material that she had left behind. So I kind of want to jump ahead now. That story is going to twist around to my first encounter with Mary Barton. I first met Mary in 2008, which was actually 5 years after she died. So that was my first encounter with her through things she left behind. And what was going on is the State Historical Museum had put up an exhibition of items from the Barton collection because it coincided with the American Quilt Society's first quilt expo and contest in Des Moines in 2008. Well, I was a student teacher then. I came to teaching as a second or third career. I'm not exactly sure. But I was teaching advanced 10th grade language arts at East High School in Des Moines. And for those of you in England who don't know how close East High School and the museum are, it's just about a 10 or 15-minute walk. So I walked all of the kids down to the museum. We were in the midst of a memoir unit that I had designed as part of my student teaching. And I wanted students to see that there are ways beyond words to tell our stories. And they were going to be designing a quilt block as a way to communicate their stories. And then we made classroom quilts out of them. Well, we went down to the museum in order to kick this little event off so that they could see some traditional blocks, some, works, and learn how people told stories through quilts. And the kids responded so well to this exhibit. They were curious, for example, about how quilt blocks got their names. They were intrigued by the stories of the people who made them, how different at first when it looked at quilt makers' lives, how different their lives were than their own. But then they started to notice a lot of similarities. Everybody wants to provide for their family. Everybody needs to keep warm, especially in our 30 below zero wind chills last week. People want to express their creativity. And as we were talking about before this got started, sometimes you just need something to do with your hands. So quilting, fulfilled all that things. Kids looked at the color choices, and compared things they liked and they didn't like, or how they would have done it differently. They just really responded to the exhibit then by telling stories of, oh yeah, my grandmother made me a quilt, and hadn't thought about maybe what all went into it. So it was a really good exercise for the kids. And it just really showed me that quilts are a very, very good meeting place. It's kind of a topic that everybody can somehow connect to. In my own classroom, I have students who come from Africa, from Bosnia, from different, different places. I think Johnston has 37 or more countries represented in this building. I can't remember. Sometimes just bringing in textiles from other places. I have things from a lot of other places. It gives us a place to start talking, what's your life like, and what do you use, and it's just a really good meeting place. According to one of Mary's speeches, that she was someone who was a reluctant speaker. She didn't like the limelight, but it came to her through quilting. But she said, the blocks in this collection are pattern records as well as fabric records. For me, they cost less, took less storage space, and were still just as important as a quilt top or quilt for study purposes. I mounted the blocks on muslin panels to show the importance to whoever would eventually have them. I realized that I was gathering information and specimens that would be shared someday. So her purpose as she collected, she knew this was going to be for educational resources. And these are just a couple of the pieces that happened to be up the day I took my 10th graders there. Well, what do you think the first thing they noticed on these blocks?
I'm going to guess the quote swastika.
The quote swastika, yes. The students, wondered, why would somebody put a swastika on a quilt? That's a Nazi symbol. Were the people who made these Nazis? Well, this was a long time ago. This was what, 13 years ago, almost 13 years ago now. And I'll have to admit, I was not nearly as smart then as I am now. I had no idea. But I think the best thing for a student is have a teacher who has no idea the answer to their question, because then they have to figure it out. And we could go on this journey of figuring it out together. So, they started doing research. They learned that the word swastika comes from an ancient Sanskrit word that meant well-being, or the idea of prosperity. And it's a symbol that is ubiquitous. It's used in cultures all over the world. Well, then my friend Jody, who's the registrar at the State Historical Museum, started showing me other artifacts that included, here's another swastika quilt. This one was made by Mennonite women. Mary Barton kept notebooks, and this is a sample page from one notebook. She would keep clippings in a binder, and every time she found a clipping of a similar pattern, she would put it on that page in the binder. And her goal was to, and she dated them, she documented everything, that her goal was to find out the earliest time a block was published. Because a block itself, they change names throughout time, so you couldn't really date it by just the block. But if you had information about the fabric, which she also collected, the block, what the maker called it might give a clue to what time period it was made, and then how the names changed over time. So she kept all of these different ways to document. And then another museum artifact that showed up, this is a Sioux pouch, Plains Indians, and they used the swastika as well. And it was funny, once you see something, you see it everywhere. I realized I took some kids to Hoyt Sherman Plaza for an event. And Hoyt Sherman Plaza is a historic home in Des Moines that has a theater and puts on a lot of historical performances or cultural performances. Walking into the lobby one day, the floor tiles were a beautiful blue and white pattern, probably from the 20s maybe, but the edge is all a swastika design around the edge of the floors. And so, once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. And even recently I heard an NPR broadcast, a National Public Radio broadcast about a Native American tribe trying to reclaim their symbol, so that it wouldn't be lost to Hitler's destruction forever. On February 7th, so just a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to interview two of Mary's sons, 2 out of 4 of her sons, and then a granddaughter and a great granddaughter. And when Art, this is her son, Art Barton, when he asked me, why are you doing this research? I told him a little bit about taking the kids and seeing part of his mom's collection and the swastika story. He disappeared quickly, ran into another room, comes back with pottery, because Mary and her husband Tom also collected pottery. She collected a lot of things, and the connections, she could make all these connections. Well, he ran back and got this piece of pottery that he said was probably a 19th century piece of pottery, and it's decorated with the swastika. So Mary just had its great ability to learn, to connect, and to share information. And her family is carrying on those traits really well. I want to look a little bit at Mary's young life, because it shapes how she collected and what she collected. And throughout all of Mary's things, you will see a reference C notebook, because she was always cross-referencing everything. So if there's fabric in a quilt, the tag might say C notebook, and then there'll be a notebook with fabric from that era, so you can compare it to other things and compare it to the patterns in her pattern notebooks. So she started this early. Art said that this is a tendency that came from her mother and grandmothers and the people before that. When I got to Art's house, and he lives in the house that Mary moved into after her husband died, Art was there, and then her son John, who were the youngest. These are the second youngest and the youngest of her 4 sons. Art had set the table with just a feast of moments of Mary's life. Childhood 4-H records, items gathered through expeditions with her husband and 4 boys. They loved to walk the shallow riverbeds near their home in Story County, Iowa. They found animal bones, American Indian arrowheads, pottery shards, agates, fossils. As kid, the 4 Barton boys found almost a complete horse skeleton through all of these expeditions, and it was only missing about 2 leg bones. And I asked, they said then they set it up in their basement. They lived in a bigger turn of the century house when they were growing up. And they said, they reassembled this skeleton in the basement as though it was a museum piece. And I said, whose idea was it to set up a skeleton in the basement? And what did your mother think? And the boys looked at each other, the boys, they're men now. They looked at each other and just started laughing and said, well, of course it was mom's idea. So she was all over this. And they, as they walked, they found all sorts of good stuff. They had samples of everything, things they'd picked up. In the meantime, they've donated a lot of these things to the Story County Historical Society, Ames Historical Society, the Iowa State University Veterinary College. All of these things, came and they used them, and then they passed them on as other objects of learning. Of course, the Barton house became the house where all the neighborhood kids wanted to gather, and their basement kind of became known as Mrs. Barton's Museum. One year, John's class, elementary class, came to visit Mary Barton's museum. Some people keep skeletons in their closets. Mary just set them up in the basement and then invited people to come and look. So they wrote thank you notes to her that I thought were really cute. This one says, "Dear Mrs. Barton, I thought your museum was very interesting. Thank you very much for inviting our class. Everybody thought it was very interesting. I am a rock collector also. I like the horse head very much. I thought the turtle skeleton was interesting too." They had a collection of small animal skulls that has since passed on to, I think, a grandson, maybe. They've passed on all of these tendencies. The next thank you note that they were all adorable, but "Dear Mrs. Barton, I had a most wonderful time seeing your museum. I think the skeleton of the horse was most interesting. And I love the penmanship. Kids today don't learn how to write cursive like that, but you could tell they had worked on this. And this was a class from 1963. You can see that on the date. Bones tell stories, just like quilts tell stories. Art told me that when they hiked the river, we'd find bones, and we would find bones that had extra growth on them and others that didn't. So they weren't just finding the bones and figuring out how to reassembling them. They were actually really examining them. And this launched the boys into a comparative osteology research study. Okay. They needed more bones for the study. So Mary called her brother, who still lived near Indianola, and said, you know, if you find a deer carcass, let us know. We need a deer skeleton. Well, her brother found a deer caught up on a fence, and the boys, they went and got it in a pickup. The younger boys helped the oldest son, Tom, clean the bones, reassemble the deer skeleton. They could use it then for comparative osteology purposes. Tom took the research then and entered it in a science fair, won a college scholarship. He's now a doctor doing research, and he's still in Uganda in his 70s, still doing research medical work in Africa. So their curiosity really, Mary's curiosity was infectious throughout the family and just kept going. Mary kept records of all sorts of 4-H memorabilia, and her dad, bless his heart, he ran a hardware store in Indianola, Iowa, but he, I can't remember if he acquired the orchard or if he bought land and planted it, but they had an orchard to keep the 6 kids and his wife busy while he was working in the hardware store. And busy they were. They ended up, this is an Iowa State Fair sweepstakes trophy, and the winners' names were engraved on it. The last 2 winners were Mary's mother, Mrs. H.H. Pemble, and she got to keep the trophy because she was the last name that would fit on it. Mary's in this photo, Des Moines Register photo from 1931. Iowa Farm Girls, you know, spelled out the words Iowa Farm Girls. Within the Pemble collection at the museum, Mary Pemble Barton collection at the museum, I'm learning to follow Mary's thinking patterns. It's a challenge, but I'm trying. Those patterns, Art believes, were instilled through the legacy of her foremothers. And there's just so many things. She has notebooks. This is Mary as a child. She has notebooks that document what she wore, the patterns that were used to construct the things. This one has the note that this was a dress constructed for her for a birthday party out of dotted Swiss, and her granddaughter now has this dress. It's got the pattern numbers, you know, shows children, so you get to see a real snapshot of the time period. This was a dress made over for Mary in the 20s from one of her mother's dresses, and she wore it with lace collar and cuffs. Mary and her sister both had matching dresses with this fabric in the 1920s, includes the name of the women who made the dresses. I suppose Mom was so busy with the orchard that sometimes she hired out the sewing. And those women were also quilters. Mary made a note of that. And then some of this fabric is in one of Mary's most famous quilts, the Heritage Quilt, which we'll get to in a little bit. But she saved all of these things from her childhood, and then as she made her biographical quilt, a lot of the fabric are things that she wore as a child. And she made her own clothes. She learned how to sew. There's a really great notebook in the collection that has all of her samples, you know, when she learned to make buttonholes or hems, and all of the grades from school are on those samples, and it's pretty fun to look at. But as a senior in high school, she was named the all-around girl athlete, graduated in 1936. And of course we have a picture, and if we have a picture, we have a sample of the fabric that made the clothing. And this one, I love this one, a note that her boyish haircut because she admired Amelia Earhart, and samples of the fabric, sketches of the dresses. And this 1936, Amelia Earhart then disappeared in 1937. And they do bear a little bit of a resemblance there. I thought that was pretty cool. This one was a dress that she made to wear to county fair wedding of 2 4-H members. Whenever she could, she always cut out newspaper articles or pattern design things, and it's all documented. She's been doing this, or she was doing this her whole entire life. So there's so much that you can see and learn about the styles. Well, that later, as she didn't quilt when she was younger. She didn't start quilting until much later. But she was, I maybe one of the earliest to start connecting fashion trends with quilts. You know, what kind of fabric were women wearing? How did that fabric make it into quilts? And that was another way she thought she could date things, by looking at the clothing styles and then the fabric that was used that would have been contemporary, and be able to figure out, you know, more about women's lives and the quilts they made. All right, so as a young adult then, Mary Pemble became Mrs. T.A. Barton. She met Tom Barton at Iowa State University. She was, and that's in Ames, Iowa. She had attended Simpson College, a small college near Indianola, her hometown, for a while, transferred to Iowa State University to get a degree in landscape architecture, which was an unusual major and career aspiration for a woman. This picture of Tom and Mary before their wedding, it's in 1939, and she notes that Tom was wearing a hand-me-down coat, and she was wearing a coat remade out of one of her dad's old coats, because of course this was during Great Depression years. And you know, they were always dressed very well. I love his hat. She made all of her own clothing, and it's fun to see the different styles. Her hat it's kind of cool too, but I like his better. And then this is 1941, a photo of Mary sitting at her typewriter. This would have been just before she graduated from Ames and just before they got married. And I looked at this photo carefully. I see the typewriter and I see her wearing the gown, the house coat, but I don't see the sewing machine, but it has to be there. It has to be there somewhere. So then in 1942, Tom Barton and Mary Alice Pemble were married. And then they moved to Washington, D.C. They graduated from Iowa State. They both had degrees in landscape architecture, moved to Washington, D.C. and worked at the Navy Hydrographic Office during World War II. And they were both engineering draftspersons for then they drew air navigation maps. Their training as landscape architects gave them all the skills they needed to draw the maps. Tom is wearing a Navy uniform because he was a Navy lieutenant. Mary made herself a dress so that she kind of looked like she was in the Navy too, but she was a civilian employee. And she was the only one working in that position. After the war, they moved to Michigan and then eventually back to Ames, where Tom became head of the landscape architecture department at Iowa State University. And Mary documented all of the clothing that she made for herself and her family. This is the family before the youngest, John, was born. When I was looking at the old albums at Art's house, you know, this picture came up and it's labeled Two Wise Old Birds, and then the other one, Babe in the Woods, from their treks through the river to find things. And they just, you could tell that from the way they talked about mom and dad together, they were a team in all of the things they did, whether she was supporting him in his career, or eventually when she started collecting quilts, he was instrumental in all of that. And I put in, I can't tell now because my block is there. Okay, a picture of John here. He wasn't born when this, but he would have been the next one, about that tall. And they have such fond memories of all this time spent together hunting for things. As part of Mary's responsibility, she joined the Faculty Wives Club, and she was known as Mrs. T.A. Barton. And there are a lot of clippings of her involvement with this club. This one comes from an exhibit that the Faculty Wives researched and put together on Carrie Chapman Catt, who was an 1880 graduate of Iowa State University, and who was instrumental, one of the women instrumental in women's suffrage movement in the United States. Art told me later, he said, because she saved all of the research, which of course Mary did not go at this, you know, half baked. She was in it all the way. and save the research. And it was beneficial later in the 90s when the college was going to name, refurbish and name a building after Carrie Chapman Catt, who graduated from Iowa State in 1880. John told me anything she got involved in, she really got into the research. And of course, we have a page from her notebook showing samples of the fabric and samples of the fabric and a sketch along with the photo of the occasion. So let's see now. Becoming Mary Pemble Barton. She was Mrs. T.A. Barton until she got started in the quilt world. Mary began collecting quilts informally in the late 1940s when she inherited quilts from her grandmother. And then in the early 1950s, her mother gave her more family quilts. She saw the quilts both as conveyors of family history, and a link to the past, but also as something they used. She used them on the beds for her kids. With 4 boys, they needed ways to keep warm, and she used the family quilts that she was given. This one, affectionately labeled Old Quilt in her notes, was used almost to death until a transplant gave it new life. And she, in her notes, said this was a quilt from the Lyle family, given to her in 1950, used on her children's beds. She said, I inherited some quilts at a time we really needed them for the children. And this one was washed until it could take no more. And she used old fabrics then to transplant worn out blocks and bring it back to life. She also mentioned that her actual real quilt collecting started one day when she was visiting her mother and saw her mother kneeling in the garden on this scrap of an old quilt. It was the summer of 1967 or 8. And she said, I must truly have started collecting that summer when I saw my mother kneeling on a quilt fragment while she was weeding the garden, and I asked for it. And this is in her collection at the State Historical Museum of Iowa. It fits in a page protector, so 8.5 inches wide. I suppose it's about an 8-inch wide or 8 by 8 inch square. It's awfully thin. I'm not sure that would have provided much padding or protection for her knees. And then Mary, as part of the Faculty Wives Club Heritage Division, they decided, partly because Mary had started inheriting these quilts and thinking about the stories, to have everybody bring their quilts together, put an exhibit on about quilts, and then Mary researched and wrote a skit, and it was women around. She called it a skit. It was more of a one-act play, I suppose you'd say. And the Faculty Wives put this on. She designed and created the quilt top that they were actually quilting in the play, all wearing period clothing and telling the stories of the quilts and how that translated in the family. And you'll notice in the caption of the newspaper story, this is from the Ames, Iowa Tribune in 1969. It's listed as, Mrs. Thomas Barton, and it goes through the work she did, the research, the hours of research, writing the script, because Mary never does anything halfway. She really, really got into it. Well, that then really inspired her to start buying old quilts. She started to notice that, at auctions and antique shops, quilts weren't valued that high back then and weren't going for very high prices. But she started noticing that dealers were getting them, taking them out of state, and she wanted to save Iowa's quilt legacy. I think she focused on quilts that were either brought to Iowa by early settlers or made by Iowans or had some connection somehow with Iowans. And she started buying quilts. And then at the same time, her research into her family history and the quilt history inspired her to start designing a quilt that would tell her story. Mary said, I never sought publicity, but it started finding me. And people began contacting me about the quilts they thought I might like to see. This was from a speech she gave in 1993. So Mary went to auctions, and of course she saved everything. We have the auction bills, we have her notes on the quilts, photos of the quilts. This one was particularly sweet. The man she bought it from then sent a postcard that said, "My grandmother was Olive Lucas Tilson, born in Belvedere, Illinois in 1847 and came to Boone, Iowa in 1860 with her husband." She talked to him and found out all of this information. She made the tulip pattern. Mary thought it was a love apple, the quilt you bought. And then her handwritten notes that are with the photo, she'd done the math, and this young bride was 13 years old when she came to Iowa. And this is a quilt she made. And then other quilts she purchased, we have the prices. She saved, information, all sorts of stuff, filling her notebooks with things that she hoped would be useful in later study, along with the quilts themselves. In the State Historical Museum collection, if you count the study panels, the individual blocks, there are about 200 panels and block samples that Mary assembled to use in her lectures. She did lectures on topics like bedding, including the mattresses, mattress care, knowing if a mattress was filled with feathers or horsehair or human hair or straw. And then, how you care for it, how you air it out. And if it's a straw mattress, always keep enough saved aside in case somebody has an accident in the middle of the night, the things you have to think about when that was your bedding. She started to also connect reading the magazines. The women at the time they made these blocks or made the quilts she collected, what were the women reading? So she collected like Godey's Ladies magazine, any of the women's publications at the time, and she would read the advice columns. Well, sometimes the advice columns said for a certain kind of blemish on your face, rub strawberries on it. So then she could figure out that on some of the old quilts that had these little red spots up by where the head would be was probably strawberry stains. And if you know what the stain is, it's easier to remove it. She also did a deep dive into research on dyes. How was fabric dyed? What were the components of the dyes? How did it affect the fabric over time? She would deconstruct quilts, sometimes using the blocks to make these panels. If a quilt wasn't in good enough shape to save, she would take it apart, and you could tell then in the seam allowances what the original color might have been. So she could do this study then of how things were dyed and how time, use, laundering, and sunlight affected the colors over time. There was just so many connections that she was making, and the women's magazines helped that too. At first, when I learned that Mary took quilts apart, it really bothered me because I make quilts. I know how much time I put into them, and I can't imagine somebody going at them with a seam ripper and taking it all apart. But the more, I learned from it, and it wasn't the, pristine condition quilts. They were ones with condition issues. But then I read a story in her notes about a quilt that she said it was an ugly quilt. It was from Great Depression era. She took it apart because she wanted to see what kind of batting was used, and because you could feel the padding, but it felt different. She got it all taken apart, and what was inside were worn out clothing that the family must have outgrown. So they used it as padding in their quilt to stay warm. So, there are things you can only learn from taking something apart. And I've had to get over my own opinions of that. This is one of Mary's notebooks. She said she first started, blue and white quilts really caught her eye. She loved blue quilts, and she kept notebooks of fabric samples for comparative purposes when she knew who produced the fabric, where it came from. That's all included. Sometimes there are advertisements and things along with the fabric. So this, an advertisement that shows, I think, I don't have my notes on this, but showing how different ideas and colors are cyclical through time and how they come back, with the fashion things. Because this to me looks not like something from the 30s, whereas these are, 30s prints, but she liked to trace the colors and the styles and how things would come in and out of fashion and back and forth through time. Art said when she came to ISU in the Faculty Women's Club, she was Mrs. T.A. Barton. She wasn't Mary Barton. That didn't come about until she started creating her own name in the quilt world, and then started going by her name, Mary Barton. Mary started her heritage quilt about the same time that she was doing research for the Faculty Wives Quilt program that they did. And she had said that that program was so popular, they were asked to do it on other occasions. So it wasn't just a one-time play, it was performed in other occasions and other places. But she started using all of the research she'd done on genealogy, all the research she'd done on family quilts and quilting to start the heritage quilt. And she said, I spent 7 years making the heritage quilt top, and then it was quilted by women of St. Petri Lutheran Church in Story City, Iowa. Mary liked to make the tops, design tops. She did a lot of hand stitching, but she didn't like to do the actual hand quilting. So she had a group of church ladies who did that for her. And she said, my heritage quilt shows the gradual progression of one generation after another of my family marrying and moving westward to Iowa. If you look closely, the men are all carrying tools here. Some of the tools included on the quilt are a mortise and tenon with a mortise chisel, a hay fork, a maul, a wedge, a grain shovel, a frame saw or bow saw, a hoe, an auger, an adze, which I had to look up. I didn't know what that was, but apparently it's a cutting tool similar to an axe that's been used since the Stone Age. The blade is just turned, instead of like an axe is flat to the handle, the blade is turned kind of perpendicular. So axes and draw knives. So the men are carrying all the tools they used. The women are, she said their pathway is lined with quilt blocks to symbolize how wherever women went, their quilts went with them. And she used, this is a map that she used to trace as the crow flies how the different families in her legacy or in her ancestry, how they made it all to Iowa. And then she reproduced that on the quilt. And here's just a couple of close-ups. You can see the beautiful quilting, the detail, the fringed pants to look like buckskin. And she said almost all of the fabric in the quilt is old fabric. She bought very little new fabric. So it was all fabric with connections to her studies, her family, her own clothing. As a child, some of those clothing samples are in there. These are close-up of two of the ladies in their blue dresses. This is her paper pattern, and it's in one of her notebooks. She has a notebook that's very detailed with different elements of the construction, and she designed the entire quilt and had it copyrighted. Now, this quilt is in the collections at the State Historical Museum of Iowa, and the copyright for the design has been transferred to the State Historical Society of Iowa as well. Here's another close-up of the women with their path paved by the quilts they made, the quilts that always went with them. Here's the note. This was the fabric that we saw earlier that she and her sister both had a dress, and she repeated the note about who made the dresses and that they were quilters. Different fabrics that when you look closely, you see them in the heritage quilt. So all old fabrics. These are kind of reproductions of letters or notes or dates the family migrated. She also had one of her grandmother's ledger books that told how much they spent on everything through a year. In one year there might have been $1 spent on calico, and then maybe there wasn't, or muslin, and then maybe there wasn't fabric for a little while, and then the next year maybe there was fabric. I'm glad I haven't kept track of all I've spent on fabric over my years. The Heritage Quilt won a first place and I think best of show in 1976. It was the American Bicentennial, and there was a category for bicentennial quilts at the State Fair. And then she entered it into a national bicentennial quilt contest and exposition. I believe she placed 6th overall and got an honorable mention ribbon. Throughout the rest of Mary's life, many of her quilts were shown in museums or different exhibitions, but she never ever entered another one into any sort of a judged contest. I think according to Art, she felt like they had moved her heritage quilt into the wrong category for the bicentennial show. They put it in an applique category instead of the bicentennial theme category, and she wasn't happy with that choice. But she didn't feel the need ever to enter contest and compete. That's not why she made the quilts. Art said that their dad was also a very accomplished woodworker, and I saw many of his pieces at their house. And Art said, I kept telling Dad, enter these in the state fair, but he didn't want to. That's not why he did it. And so that seemed to be a value as well. According to Art, when Mary was the Faculty Women's Club president, she sent letters out to recruit new members. And one came back to her from somebody who pointed out to Mom that this person didn't feel this was an organization they wanted to belong to because all these women were in the shadows of their husbands. I think Mom had an awakening there. It was the early 1970s, and she started going by the name Mary Pemble Barton then rather than Mary Barton or Mrs. T.A. Barton. She saw something new that she hadn't seen before, an awakening. So Mary Pemble Barton was then inducted into the Quilters Hall of Fame in 1984. Magazines, newspapers, books, television shows featured interviews with Mary Barton, stories about her life and work. I found she had compiled a resume, and I knew she'd been on Georgia Bonesteel's lap quilting program. And then there in the collection, there's notes and things. She did a series of programs for local WOI-TV in Ames, but there were several other TV programs and things she was on that I wasn't aware of. I mean, there's a lot going on that I'm not aware of, and I'll probably never know it all. But the quilts, the quilts remain. And this was one that she made for her grandkids. So for Art's kids that they were supposed to use on their beds when they were sick. It's called A Horse of a Different Color. And each horse has something, like to play with on it, the fringe balls or different parts of the horse, so that a child laying in bed sick could look at the horses and play with the fringe and have something comforting. Leah, Art's daughter, Mary's granddaughter, said that this was her favorite quilt of all of them. Leah, as a granddaughter, was an answer to Mary's prayer. She had 4 boys and she really wanted a daughter. Never got one. Art said she had lost a number of babies during pregnancy and just never got her daughter. So she enjoyed teaching Leah how to sew. And Leah is a quilter now. She's got a young family and career, so she's only made a couple of quilts, but she's got all of Grandma's scraps and sewing machines and things, so that she's carrying on that tradition. And the quilt that Art is looking at here, it's called Hawaii Remembered. She was making that for her husband, Tom, to remember a trip that they'd taken together, but unfortunately he died before that one was complete. But that one, there are numerous pictures of that quilt in different exhibitions, and her work, was just exquisite on that. This is a family quilt that had, I think this was Mary's sister, because it has that fabric that they both had dresses out of. And Mary's block in this quilt has fabric from, I think it was the birthday dress that she was wearing in one of the early slides I showed you. This was a quilt Mary made for Leah out of some fabric that she got in England, I believe. But you know, all these family memories. And then the heritage quilt was selected as one of the 100 best quilts of the 20th century, which only, you know, propelled Mary to more fame, more speaking engagements. So the shy, withdrawn person who didn't, you know, I would have loved to have known her, because here's a woman who encourages her children to put together a horse skeleton in the basement, and has all of these activities, but she really, really didn't like public speaking, but she did it because she loved her topic, loved her work. I found in the collection, as I was reading through her correspondence, whenever she was asked to speak somewhere that wasn't local, she always needed somebody to pick her up. So if she was going to a quilt congress and needed to fly somewhere, they had to arrange to have her picked up by someone, taken to the airport, you know, and then transportation arranged. And it always said in the notes, you know, she said, well, I don't drive. I'd be happy to do this. I don't drive, if you can find arrangements. And I wondered if, you know, she ever drove, or if something had happened that she couldn't drive. And Art laughed, and she said, well, she never passed her driver's test. She had a learner's permit, but every time she was going to go take the test, she was pregnant, so she didn't do the test. So she never learned how to drive. And that just was kind of a funny fact that stuck out to me. Art said that, you know, our weekends, every weekend, we would be on the river, hiking the Skunk River and the Squaw Creek. It was Squaw Creek. That's just something she enjoyed very much and kept it up throughout her life. One of the last things she did before she passed away, she went with us, and that's when we found the buffalo skull. And this now, I think it's at the Ames Historical Society, but he said they, you know, did measurements and things, and because of the breadth of the bone and everything, this would have been almost, you know, like prehistoric era. It wasn't like more contemporary buffalo skulls, but one of their last outings. And then John said that, you know, when we were rock hunting before, we would always just walk from sandbar to sandbar in these shallow rivers, shallow creeks. But Mary got to where she couldn't do that anymore because she walked with a cane and was very unsteady. So they figured up with this idea, they came up with this idea of floating her in a raft, and they just pulled her from sandbar to sandbar. And they said she just absolutely loved it, had a great time that day. And then 2003, later that year, she died. So they just have so many memories of these excursions. Quilting was one of Mary's loves and collecting, but she collected throughout her life. After she donated, she had planned to write a book that brought together all of these different ideas of how you could date quilts and how you could put women's lives together through all these various things. The archives are full of different chapter starts or book introductions, or she'd say, when I write my someday book, I will. And then all these notes. When I was at Art Barton's house, there were more notes and chapter starts and book starts, and they're very interesting. You know, I wish she would have finished them, but she got to the point, Art thought, where either it was just too much and she couldn't pull it together, or she had amassed everything she wanted and decided just to donate the materials, because she really hoped all of these things would be available for research and for study. But in her last years in an assisted living facility, she collected die-cast airplanes, World War II era, because her brother had been shot down over Japan. So she collected books and airplanes. John said she had about 1,000 of those by the time she was done, because she wanted to learn everything about her brother's experience in the war and in his life. So quilts in the collection at the Historical Museum. This is an example. Mary would buy things, and then this is just taken from the description in the online archive or the online search catalog. So you can look, you can see patterns. If a date is known, it'll tell you, you know, approximately the date. It'll tell you when and where she bought it, if that information is available. And here's, this one is great. It's a blue and white quilt. She said her first, she loved the blue and white quilts. The first several that she and Art purchased were, or not Art, she and her husband Tom purchased were different ocean wave quilts. Tom and Mary were a team in this. She'd go to auctions and things. Sometimes if she couldn't go, he'd go, and she said he'd be so happy when he came home with a box full of scraps of fabric, clippings from newspapers, women's magazines, because he knew, that was her happy place. And this one, Goose Tracks with a Wild Goose Chase border, it lists usually where they got the information for naming it. There are different sources listed, and where she purchased it. Another one, Glitter Star. And then this is what, if you go on the State Historical Museum's website and look in their search engine, this is what comes up. I just did a screenshot so that you could see, and it gives all the information that it can, the accession number, and there's a way you can click on the link and copy and paste it into your research, so you can go straight back to it if you want to. Photographs, it's really a wonderful, wonderful resource. And this is the online catalog link. If you just do a search for State Historical Museum of Iowa and then research and then objects, it will take you to the catalog. Mary donated more than I found in an article written in one of the State Historical Society publications, that she donated more than 1,500 objects to the museum. That includes quilts, quilt blocks, study panels, notebooks of research, clothing from the family, heirlooms, dishes, you name it, things that represent that period in time are there. In a way, it's kind of a time capsule, but that image has an idea of something is closed, and a capsule is something you can close. I really see it more as it's moments in time, but they are so linked to everything that came before. And now through reaccessing all of these things, it's like it's all linked things going in the future. Quilts and education, taking my students there as a teacher, I'm going to tell you what I do with this in education. Objects help humanize events, let learners visualize things over time. You can look at things from multiple perspectives. You can be actively engaged. You can look at something and then figure out, how can I do this myself? How can I adapt this? Whether it's paper and glue, scissors, fabric, thread. You can connect in conversations and discuss perspectives. A couple of years ago, I got to, maybe a year ago, interview some of the museum staff about Mary's quilt. And the curator mentioned, he said, it's got good visual imagery, put it next to a Conestoga wagon in an exhibit, and it really enhances the meaning. Or you could ask, what does it represent about American settlement? You've got churches and log cabins, you've got domestic roles, you've got men's roles. You've also got just one side of the westward expansion. So examining this artifact allows us to really think about and ask questions and maybe struggle with more complex meaning, because it's a quilt, it's non-threatening, it's a comfortable place to enter a conversation. Last February, I believe, just before the pandemic, Jody Evans from the museum brought the heritage quilt into my classrooms. We were having a school-wide cultural day, and so we had rotations of students going through, and we had students look at the quilt, and figure out, what does this symbolize? What does a Conestoga wagon symbolize? What do the women and their quilts, the men and their tools? And they analyzed the symbolism, what they saw in the quilt. It was very heavy. So, after a while, the boys had to put their arms down, because this is a heavy quilt when you're holding it up. But then we started looking. We also had on posted in the room, this is a story cloth by Shawa Her from Iowa, 60 by 84 inches, embroiders the story of the Hmong migration to Iowa, starting back in the upper left-hand corner with, when the Hmong people were in China. There's the Great Wall of China, coming all the way down to where they're boarding airplanes and coming to the United States. Putting them side by side, you get two immigration stories. This is the Wakachachi. I don't even know if I can pronounce that correct, but the talking papers, that's a Meskwaki artifact, and it is depicting, you know, a hunt. It's autobiographical fishing scenes and things. Put that next to the heritage quilt, and you can have a discussion of you know, two different ways of living in this space that became Iowa. Another thing Jody brought when we did our classroom presentation were some moccasins, woodland moccasins with the beadwork. And we talked about, you know, why do you think woodlands Indians would have, I think we had some Plains Indians artifacts too that had more geometric designs, and the woodlands had more floral and leaf and nature inspired. Well, it's because of what they're seeing around them. And you know, I always ask is, what do you think the flowers mean? What does this mean? And kids are quiet for a while, and I don't mind quiet, so I just wait. And finally a kid looked at me and he said, well, it's probably the shoe company logo, just like my shoe. And he stuck his leg up, you know, with his basketball shoes. I think they were Air Jordans or something. And, you know, I think he thought he was being funny, but it's really, he's correct. You can kind of tell where these were made, where they came from by the decorations. It's another way to tell a story and use the artifacts to do so. Future, I would love to be able to use heritage quilt objects such as that as lessons, as a point of departure for other immigration stories, other stories of how do we trace our family? What does it mean? What do the things we keep and cherish mean to us? If I could teach whatever I wanted to all day long, we'd be doing a lot of this kind of stuff. Future directions for the Barton collection exploration. This is Mary's daughter or granddaughter, Leah, reading. This is a notebook of index cards with introduction to a chapter of a someday book. Another one, I hadn't seen this one yet, so that was fun to read as well. This is Mary's great granddaughter who they never met. Mary or Leah was pregnant with Nora when Mary died, and Nora is trying to read a speech written by Mary's mother to give at a mother-daughter banquet, except it's in cursive, and she was struggling with that a little bit. But Nora had some, you know, just some beautiful things to say about her grandmother, even though they never met. You know, she said, I can Google my grandmother and get Wikipedia biographies. I get links to quilt sites. I look at the quilt sites and I can say, hey, Mom, look, we have that quilt, you know, so that's been kind of fun for her. And then she has inherited some of the collections. There was a collection of campaign buttons in Mary's stuff, you know, and she likes to look at those and figure out what was going on, what the issues were. Other kids in their family have inherited some of the other collections, military things and things. So there, it's continuing that curiosity, you know, here, look at this, figure out what it is and what it means, is continuing. So, any questions? That was a lot of stuff. Thank you for listening.
It was fantastic, Millie. I just, Mary is, it's just a fascinating history. To think about one person collecting so many of these artifacts, having such foresight to really, to realize that these would be important historical artifacts, and that someday somebody would be really interested in, and that they would have an important meaning in our study of so many things. You know, I've heard say that the study of textiles is really the study of everything, because textiles are literally woven, pun somewhat intended, through all areas of history, and have had such an impact on some other things. So Elaine is commenting she would have had to have a lot of room to store all those collections. Now, I think you told me something about her home, although you were never in it. Maybe, well, did you tell that to somebody else?
I've heard from museum personnel who actually went to retrieve the collections and take it to the museum. Her first home was a very large, you know, turn of the century home, had the museum in the basement and everything. The home she moved to 5 years after Tom died was much, much smaller. And but just like I had to make clarify, I'm not locking my children in the hallway and shirking my duties to do this program. Her house, she was not, it didn't look like, a hoarder or anything. It was very meticulous and very orderly. Each bed probably had 10 quilts on it. And the closets were very orderly shelves with all of the binders. And Jody Evans told me, she kind of put things in paper grocery bags to prepare them, to have them in order and prepared for pickup by the museum staff. And they just kept bringing things out. Nobody could figure out where it was coming from because it was so orderly. And that house is still very orderly today, but every 2 minutes art would disappear and go somewhere and pull out, he pulled out her button collections. And then for the shell buttons, he had shells that you could see where the buttons were drilled out of the clam shells, from the Mississippi River and things. And so, they just are very good organizers and very good at keeping things where where they are, and accessible and out of sight. So
yeah, I used every last little bit of space, it sounds.
Yeah.
So there's just a couple of things coming into the chat window about Mary Pemble Barton's connection to Georgia Bone Steel. Jody Sanders, who is an Iowan and the editor for American Patchwork and Quilting magazine, was on the fundraising committee for housing the collection at the State Historical Museum in 1993. And Georgia Bone Steel was the honorary chair in Iowa. And sounds like Georgia Bone Steel may have been born in Iowa as well. So
yeah, and I know the Des Moines Area Quilt Guild was also, a lot of members volunteered then to help catalog every item that was in the collection. I mean, it's a lot of stuff.
Sure, yeah. Do you want to turn off your screen share for if you've finished sharing your?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So we're closing in on, we need to kind of wrap things up. And I was telling Millie, I have to be careful because I tend to do this Iowa goodbye thing where I say that it's time to finish. And then I think of one more thing to say and one more thing to say. But
it's
Millie,
like phone calls with my mom.
Yeah, right. Yes. And me as well. It drives my husband nuts. But we do have to kind of close up because Millie has to go and teach again. But while I'm typing a couple things into the chat window where people can learn about the Iowa Quilt Museum a little bit more, Millie, why don't you quick tell us about the quilt behind you?
Oh, this was one, my friend Jody and I, we go on a lot of adventures together. Jody always says we've been through a lot together, and then she'll point at me and say most of it's her fault, meaning me. But we do the Iowa shop hop together frequently. And this was a couple of years ago for the shop hop, the central Iowa district of the shop hop. When you went to the store, they gave you either a fat quarter or a fat eighth, or a width of fabric quarter yard, and a pattern. You bought the pattern and then you got it stamped everywhere and they would give you the fabric. So this is what I put together with the pattern and the fabric they gave me. And then I added a couple of borders because the original one didn't have borders down the side, just the top and the bottom. And I wanted borders around the side too. So that was my shop hop quilt from a couple of years ago.
Cool. And the one sitting behind me, or hanging behind me rather, is part of our current exhibit, which is String Theory, String Pieced Quilts from Past to Present. Next week we will have one more program about our exhibit. We'll have our last few exhibit contributors. We've been kind of bouncing back and forth between exhibit topics and more Iowa-based topics. So next week will be that. If you have a desire to catch any of our past programs, they are all recorded and archived on our website. I just popped that into the chat window, but the general website is iowaquiltmuseum.org. So you can find past programs. You can join our email list if you want to know about upcoming programs and exhibits. You can find our online gift shop. You can make a financial donation to the Iowa Quilt Museum if you're finding that these programs are beneficial. And you can learn more about how you can come and visit the Iowa Quilt Museum. We are open and welcoming visitors, even though we're encouraging mask wearing and social distancing, of course. But this current exhibit will be up for another just shy of 4 weeks. March 21st is when it will go down. So pop over to the Iowa Quilt Museum. Millie, is there a way that you want people to know how they can reach you, or do you just want them to kind of reach
Sure.
you through me?
My email is millie.kehrli@drake.edu.
And I just popped that into the chat window as well. So
Yeah, if you have questions or anything, I'd love to talk to you. If you worked with Mary or on the committee that helped catalog things, and you want to talk to me about it, let me know. My research continues.
yeah, that's what I was going to say. I'm guessing that there are several people on the talk today who have personal experiences with Mary,
Mhm.
Mary Barton. And in fact, somebody called the museum yesterday and wanted to be connected with you. So I'll see if I can make
Okay,
that happen. But
awesome. That was my bell. I gotta go.
Bell, so we have
Yeah,
got to wrap up. Thank you so much to Millie
thank
for
you.
being with us today. Thank you to everyone for being online with us. And we'll hope to see you again next week, Tuesday at 12.